By this May, we are finally getting the long-awaited Mortal Kombat sequel, and one of the biggest selling points right away is the expanded roster. A lot of new faces are joining the movie, and what's interesting is that most of these additions are clearly stacked on the villain side. The sequel is going much harder into antagonists, and among all of them, one character easily sits at the top of the hype list. Noob Saibot, played by Joe Taslim. His return honestly felt inevitable the moment the first movie ended. Bi-Han's death at the hands of Scorpion and Cole Young never felt like a full stop, more like a comma. For anyone familiar with Mortal Kombat lore, that scene was basically a setup. His story didn't end there, it just flipped the page. The sequel turns him into something else entirely. No longer just Sub-Zero, but an undead warrior reborn from the Netherrealm. New form, new powers, new purpose, and a completely different presence on screen. We already got our first official look at him in the trailer, and since then, several high-quality images have leaked showing him from different angles. One detail that instantly caught fans' attention is his eyes. In some shots, his pupils are completely white, giving him that full supernatural noob vibe. In others, his eyes look almost normal, like you're still seeing traces of Bi-Han under all that darkness. That contrast feels intentional, like the movie is visually playing with the idea that this isn't just a monster, but a twisted continuation of a man who already died once. Costume-wise, the filmmakers clearly leaned hard into MK11. His armor is almost a direct translation from the game. The mask shape, the layered plating, the overall silhouette, it's all very close to his MK11 default design. You can tell the team didn't want to reinvent him too much, and honestly, that's probably the right call. Earlier, insider rumors claimed his look would just be a black recolor of Sub-Zero's armor from the first film with jet black skin and glowing white eyes. That idea sounded lazy even back then, and thankfully it didn't pan out. What we're getting instead is a proper distinct Noob Saibot design that feels game accurate, but still grounded enough to work in a live action movie. One of the cooler surprises is the inclusion of his shadow clone. In the lore, Noob's shadow is called Saibot, essentially a living extension of his dark power. The trailer and leaked shots suggest Saibot appears as a separate entity with its own visual identity, not just a copy-paste effect. Again, this feels heavily inspired by MK11, where Saibot was treated as a true combat partner rather than a simple visual trick. That alone opens the door for some wild fight choreography, especially in a cinematic format. As for how much screen time Noob actually gets, that's still unclear. What is clear is his motivation: revenge, specifically revenge on Scorpion. His death was personal, brutal, and humiliating, and the sequel sets up what is essentially round 2 between these two characters. The trailer already teases their confrontation, and all signs point to their rematch happening during a massive battle sequence rather than a quiet one-on-one duel. From what we can piece together, this clash likely takes place somewhere in the Netherrealm. Scorpion isn't alone either. He's fighting alongside Earthrealm's champions, including Johnny Cage and others, turning the location into a full-scale war zone rather than just a backdrop. It feels less like a simple rematch and more like two old enemies colliding in the middle of something much bigger. If I had to guess, this confrontation happens either in the second half of the movie or very close to the finale, once all sides have fully committed to war. Noob's origin itself sticks very closely to canon. Bi-Han dies at Scorpion's hands and is later resurrected as Noob. The key difference here is how that resurrection happens. Enter Quan Chi. His debut in the sequel changes everything. Played by Damon Harriman, Quan is easily one of the most important new characters in the movie. He's not just responsible for bringing Noob Saibot back, he represents a narrative cheat code for the franchise. With Quan Chi in play, death becomes flexible. Characters who died in the first film are suddenly back on the table. Kung Lao is the biggest example, but he's not the only one. Mortal Kombat has always played fast and loose with death, timelines, and resets both in the games and other adaptations. This movie clearly isn't afraid to embrace that. Quan Chi's presence gives the writers permission to resurrect characters, twist alliances, and completely reshape the board going forward. Noob's new arc doesn't exist in isolation either. The sequel is expected to dig deeper into the long-standing conflict between the Lin Kuei and the Shirai Ryu. That history is essential to both Sub-Zero and Scorpion, and Noob sits right at the center of it. Some test screening rumors even suggest the movie drops heavy hints about the arrival of the second Sub-Zero, Kuai Liang. According to those who've seen early cuts, he isn't fully revealed on screen, but the dialogue and visual cues strongly suggest his existence. This lines up with what we know about the reshoots. New Line and Warner Brothers did additional filming around November, and when the release date was pushed to May, a lot of people assumed it meant the studio wasn't happy with the movie. Both producer Todd Garner and director Simon McQuoid have pushed back on that idea multiple times, saying the film was already finished and the reshoots were story-driven, not damage control. That makes it very possible they use those reshoots to plant seeds for future installments. Something as simple as a silhouette, a shadow, or a final tease could quietly introduce a new Sub-Zero without ever officially announcing casting. I can already picture how that scene might play out, a cold, restrained tease rather than a big reveal, but for now that's still speculation. What remains a complete mystery is Noob Saibot's fate by the end of the movie. Does he die again, sacrificed in the war between realms, or does he survive and slip back into the shadows? Mortal Kombat history suggests the latter is always an option. If the sequel performs well and a third film gets greenlit, Noob feels like exactly the kind of character you keep around. He's tied too deeply into the lore, the clan wars, and Quan Chi's schemes to just be a one-and-done villain. Either way, his inclusion alone signals that this sequel is aiming to feel more like Mortal Kombat at its core. Darker, messier, more mythological, and less afraid to lean into the chaos that made the games iconic in the first place. Another angle the sequel seems to be quietly setting up is how Noob fits into the overall power hierarchy of the villains. In the first movie, Outworld felt dangerous but a bit fragmented. Shang Tsung was clearly calling the shots, yet many of his fighters felt more like hired muscle than true threats with agency. Noob changes that dynamic. He's not loyal in the traditional sense. In the games, he often serves Quan Chi, but never fully submits to anyone. If the movie leans into that, Noob could easily become a wildcard antagonist, someone who technically fights on the villain side, but ultimately follows his own agenda. That kind of character adds tension not just for the heroes, but for the villains too. There's also a strong thematic opportunity with Noob that the first film didn't really explore with Sub-Zero. Identity. Bi-Han coming back as Noob isn't just a physical transformation, it's a complete rejection of who he used to be. The sequel could play with this idea visually and narratively, showing moments where traces of his past resurface only to be violently shut down. That internal conflict, even if it's mostly implied rather than spelled out, would instantly make him more than just a silent killer in black armor. Mortal Kombat villains work best when they feel tragic and cruel at the same time, and Noob is basically built for that. In the games, Noob's backstory always carried this weight of corruption and lost honor. He was the Lin Kuei's deadliest assassin, a warrior respected and feared, and then he became this hollow shell serving forces he once would have destroyed. The movie has a real chance to tap into that fall from grace without overdoing the exposition. Another thing worth considering is how his powers might affect the scale of action scenes. Shadow-based abilities allow for fights that feel fundamentally different from anything we saw in the first movie. Teleporting through darkness, splitting into multiple entities, overwhelming opponents psychologically rather than just physically. If the choreography team really commits, Noob's fights could feel more like horror sequences than traditional martial arts battles. That would be a smart way to visually separate him from characters like Scorpion and Sub-Zero, whose styles are already well established on screen. Imagine a fight where Noob doesn't just attack head-on, but manipulates the environment itself, using shadows to disorient, trap, and isolate his enemies. That kind of approach would make every encounter with him feel unpredictable and genuinely threatening. One of the most interesting leaks that surfaced recently mentioned that Noob has at least 2 major fight sequences in the film. The first is supposedly a shorter encounter early on that establishes his abilities and sets up his grudge against Scorpion. The second is that big Netherrealm battle we already talked about. If that leak holds up, it means Noob isn't just background muscle, he's got a real arc even if he doesn't say much. Joe Taslim already proved in the first movie that he can carry a character through presence and physicality alone. His Sub-Zero didn't need tons of dialogue to feel menacing and memorable. Noob should work the same way, but turned up a notch. Less human, more predator. There's also been some chatter about whether Noob will speak at all in the sequel. In MK11, his voice is distorted, layered, and almost demonic. Some fans are hoping the movie goes that route, while others think silence would make him scarier. Personally, I think a middle ground could work best. Let him speak, but only sparingly, and when he does, make it sound wrong, like his voice is coming from somewhere else or being filtered through the void. That way you preserve the horror element without losing the chance to deliver a killer line or two. Something short and brutal that reminds you this used to be Bi-Han but isn't anymore. Finally, Noob's presence hints at a much darker tone for where the franchise could go next. Once you introduce necromancy, corrupted souls and characters who exist between life and death, the universe naturally expands into something more supernatural and less grounded. That opens the door for future villains, deeper Netherrealm politics, and even morally gray storylines where Earthrealm's champions might have to make uncomfortable choices. Even if Noob doesn't dominate the sequel, his existence alone pushes Mortal Kombat into a space that feels closer to the game's later eras, where everything is is bigger, darker, and way more unhinged. We're talking Deadly Alliance vibes, Deception-level stakes, the kind of storytelling where death doesn't mean anything and alliances shift constantly. If the sequel commits to that direction, and judging by everything we've seen so far it looks like it is, then Noob Saibot isn't just a cool addition, he's the gateway to a much wilder and more unpredictable franchise moving forward.